In the run-up to the Doctor Who review guide covering a certain episode of Series 8, I thought it would be interesting to look at another episode of that series as sort of a counterpoint to that beforehand, and Time Heist seems to be like a natural candidate, as it was the only episode of the series I didn't actually remember all that well, and therefore didn't already have a formed opinion on. It does feel kind of forgotten, not controversial enough to be called one of the worst, but also I don't see it defended as often as many other Moffat-era episodes. As I said, it's the only episode of the series I don't remember or had much of an opinion on. Even having not watched them in a while, I could easily describe at length why I hate The Caretaker or why I really like Mummy on the Orient Express. This episode, it was a blank really, so it felt like a natural choice. Unfortunately, you remember I said I thought it would be interesting to look at this. Well, tragically I was wrong, as interesting is not a word I would use to describe this episode in any way. In fact, it dawned on me why this episode feels like it gets less attention than the rest of the series. It's just very unremarkable. It's not particularly awful, but it's not any good either. It has some interesting ideas, and I'm always happy to see the show try something different, but the execution just lets it down. Characters and plots are underdeveloped, motivations not fleshed out, and it bizarrely feels both rushed and like it has time to spare at the same time. It has a good central mystery, but not a great deal else. I don't like Series 8 much as a whole, and I could point to several reasons why. So many weak episodes, poor and inconsistent characterisation of the title character, an absolutely insufferable second lead, poor secondary characters with some absolutely bizarrely idiotic decisions, like making a war criminal the main love interest of the series, for instance. But ignoring all that, even ignoring the fact that out of the 12 episodes, I only actually like 2, maybe 3, the biggest problem was that I was reminded of while watching this episode it feels like directionless, this series. I just don't for a moment feel like they had any idea what they wanted to do with these ideas and characters, what stories they wanted to tell and why. There was the character arc for the Doctor they were going for, but it just ended up so inconsistent and poorly thought out, it just contributed to this feeling even more. Series 9, on the other hand, has a lot of crap episodes as well, but the main reason why it's better than 8 overall is because this feeling is absent. Now, God knows I don't think it was a good direction they went in for that series, but it didn't feel like it was stumbling around in the dark trying and failing to find the light switch as Series 8 was, metaphorically. Time Heist is this problem more or less perfectly encapsulated. The problem I have with this episode is that it feels like it just does not have a direction in mind. Is this an unwinding mystery? Is it a character piece? Is it a wider look at human behaviour, its motivations and consequences? Is it a comedy? Hell no. The biggest problem is a total lack of focus that makes it feel like the episode is only really focused on getting from one event to the other. My most frequent criticism of the Moffat era is that it's mostly style over substance, and it's difficult to shake that idea when watching this episode, and not really seeing any story progress apart from new things happens. But we'll get to all that. First, let us examine the production of the story, which I can describe in one word: bizarre. Time Heist was directed by Douglas MacKinnon, who did one story in the RTD era before becoming a reasonably prolific director of the mid-Moffat era. God, I'm talking about Doctor Who showrunners as if they're some Egyptian dynasties. Anyway, McKinnon's list of credits is mostly fairly mediocre episodes, but it's difficult to blame him for most of that. For what I remember about those episodes, the directing is competent and serviceable. Which is kind of what makes this episode all the more bizarre. I wouldn't go as far as to say it's badly directed. In some places it's quite well done, it's just odd. Now, in fairness, much of this is the script. It is uneven and choppy and makes several poor decisions of its own. Equally, many of the weirder decisions on screen are probably because the script was so bare bones the running time had to be filled out somehow. Like, in a story where essentially nothing is given any real time to develop, did you really need an extensive shot of the Doctor and Clara separating to walk down 2 separate corridors, then joining up with each other at the end? Of course not. But think about what the genesis of such a shot would have been. It would have wanted the director going, Steven, I reckon you should take out parts where you develop the supporting characters or give the villain a proper motivation so I can put this rubbish shot in. It would have been, Steven's asked me to focus on spectacle again, so I have to fill out the runtime with pointless crap as otherwise this episode won't even break 40 minutes. Now, could a truly great director have found ways to do this in a way that enhanced the story through visual storytelling? Yeah, but it's not something that many Who directors have ever been able to pull off. It's not a show with those kind of resources to be able to do that truly effectively. And I'm not gonna penalise every director for not being Graham Harper, so that explains some of the oddness, but it doesn't suddenly make it go away. There are so many frankly bizarre things about the way the story is presented. The editing, for instance, is a very unique way of doing things, but the problem is that unique in this case is just another word for cheap and gimmicky. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. The last episode was 40 minutes long, and I really don't want to repeat that for Time Heist of all bloody things. But safe to say, it does feel very, well, as I said, gimmicky. Like this random instance of slow-mo. Why? It does feel sometimes like we're a step away from an Austin Powers transition, and it boggles me why MacKinnon thought this was a good idea. Was it to try and add a bit of sparkle to a pretty lightweight script? Maybe, but then I do think that's the wrong approach to take. A more workmanlike approach, focusing on visual storytelling, editing, and performances, would do a better job than whatever the hell this is. Honestly, it's the equivalent of a Star Wars wipe, only without the fact that wipes have been a lovable part of Star Wars since the beginning. Also, Dougie, when they said mood lighting, they meant how you use lighting in a way to set the mood, not planting random primary colours everywhere, as if this was a silent movie and you have to tint it to set the atmosphere. Oh, and another tip, don't shoot your monster in a mysterious and shrouded way, complete with jump scare reveal, when we've already seen it. The cat is probably a bit out of the bag. Anyway, as I said, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but it just feels very bizarre sometimes. There is a great deal MacKinnon gets right about this though, and equally much of what doesn't work feels like it's just his being handed the poor hand by what the script gives him. As I've said, it feels like much of it was just to fill out the runtime, and even when that's not the case, the words on the page at certain parts just leave so little to be found that it's hard to blame the bloke whose job it was to put it on the screen. Like the opening, for instance. In theory, this should be quite an effective opening, suddenly cutting from the phone call to the pre-heist meeting as it does, and I'll give MacKinnon credit that the initial shock and panic is conveyed quite well. But then the script just pulls the rug out from under him with some baffling decisions, like cutting to credits with the Doctor opening a suitcase. Ooh. Incredibly, that does not create much tension, and it's all the more odd because 2 minutes or so later we get the "we're about to rob the unrobbable bank" or whatever is exactly they said bit, which makes a better lead into the titles by pretty much any metric, as it's a lead into the overall plot of the episode and a great, even if pretty cliched, setup, rather than "ooh, a suitcase is opening." He also faces the problem of Steven Moffat's usual issues regarding tone.
Please stand away from the door. We do not wish to hurt you before incineration.
Yeah, because when I think tense situation with basically the whole plot being set up, I think it's time for some really shit jokes even by Steven Moffat's low standards. What is the director supposed to do there? So I have sympathy. Although he does make one baffling choice in this scene, giving the mysterious man giving the exposition that sets up the entire plot a barely intelligible voice that makes him sound like the bloke from the Saw movies. Now, I get why, as this is actually the Doctor and Peter Capaldi does have quite a distinct dialect, so it needs to be disguised a lot, but it's still ridiculous I can barely understand extremely important information like this. I think like a purely electronic voice would have been clearer and achieved the same mystery, as it would have been clear that it was a computer talking for someone else. So yeah, that was a misstep. Otherwise though, I do sympathise with a lot of his efforts, and there's some genuinely good stuff, some great shots of the teller for instance, and despite the odd lighting, the corridor scenes do have a certain level of tension to them, and while there are issues with the bits where the teller tries to access our heroes' minds in the script, it does work well on screen. It's a nice bit of tension, definitely. Generally, I do also like much of the way it's shot. It does emphasise both larger scale and more intimacy when it needs to, and the pacing works well in preventing it feeling like we're just speeding through, so overall the directing job is serviceable, but the more bizarre bits do weigh it down. Not bad though. As for the rest of the production, I feel like this needs explaining a general concept about TV. See, obviously every series of TV is allocated a certain budget, and a 12-episode series of Doctor Who is allocated a certain amount just like anything else. But of course they don't just divide that number by 12 and give an equal amount to every episode, as every episode does have different requirements. For instance, to use Series 8 as an example, more money would have been required for, say, Deep Breath with its extensive effects and location shooting, or Robot of Sherwood for the same reason, or the two-part finale for the same reason, so that requires less being spent on other episodes. Cheap episodes, in order to allow the budget increases for episodes like that, are known as bottle episodes. Again, looking at this series, the obvious bottle episode is The Caretaker, with just a generic school set, one crappy robot as the only effect, and limited guest stars. And a shit script as well, but nobody told them that wasn't necessary to save money. Time Heist is a step above the bottle episode, a jug episode, or perhaps a small bowl episode. It does have some new, but quite simple sets, a few effects but nothing too much, a monster costume and a reasonably well-known guest star, but not much more than that. So bear in mind before I criticise, there's a reason for it that I know about and accept. I'll also keep it brief. Most of the sets look like generic plain, just random corridors and stuff like that, and in particular this office set looks like it's made up of a few cardboard panels. Again, I get why, so I'm not going to blame them, but I'm also not going to pretend it looks good when it doesn't. The CGI is also not great, in particular the big hall area looks kind of fake, as in PS2 game fake, but again, same thing. What I will give them is that the teller is quite a good costume. It looks both threatening and sympathetic, which is good as that's what's required of it. One area that does let the side down and that isn't budget related is the music though. I like a lot of Murray Gold's music, and in fact the 12th Doctor's theme is a favourite piece of his for me, but it's misused in this episode. It should not have been playing, for instance, when a character is in the middle of vaporising herself because she's having her mind probed, which in my opinion calls for a slightly more subdued and sombre piece in this. Yes, I know she's not actually being vaporised, but neither the characters nor the audience knew that at the time, so the point stands. The music in general doesn't really convey the atmosphere either, so it is a letdown for me. Overall for the production, it's not exactly a shining example of producing Who, but most of its failings are minor and or understandable. So, to the words on the page. All 5 of them. Okay, obviously that's not quite fair, but the biggest problem with this episode for me is how thin the script really is. As I said, the reason why it sometimes felt like the directing was padding it a bit there's not enough here. And yet there are so many threads in this episode, so many ideas and characters that in a way it feels bloated as well. How can both be possible? Well, when New Who finds a will, it can certainly find a way. This episode was co-written by Moffat and Steve Thompson. However, Thompson's less of an impressive Who resume aside from this episode, and the fact that so many of the issues with the episode have Moffat written all over them, I'm inclined to believe this was the case of Thompson just doing an outline and then Moffat fleshing it out, to use that phrase very loosely. Therefore, I'll mostly be referring to him throughout this. I'll start, however, with what does work, and I'll always be fair and point out when there is stuff that works. The main positive of the script is that it does create and develop quite an effective mystery. It starts out with a sharp shock by placing the characters in the situation and giving the perfect amount of information to start out. We're here to rob the unrobbable bank, but not saying why or how, and indeed who's putting them up to it. Ignoring the previous point that you can't bloody understand what's being said, giving the exposition here to set up what's happening and make sure there's not confusion, but also keeping most of the setup secret so it can be developed and revealed as they go along, was a great idea and it works quite well. It's a great setup and structure and certainly the most effective part of the script. The reveals come along at a decent pace, but I think it's quite effective how it's only very small stuff. For instance, that inside the vaults of the bank are their rewards for taking part of this, that's a small reveal, or that they need the not quite disintegrators as a backup option. But this is all while the primary mystery remains as such almost all the way through. It's not until the end that we find out the core parts of it, who set them up to this and why. And I'll give them this, the resolutions are quite clever and do form a satisfying conclusion. That I was the Doctor the whole time is both interesting and quite an intelligent conclusion to the episode, and indeed plays to the idea of this Doctor as the ruthless pragmatist, to the point where he's willing to play himself to get things done. So I like this, particularly the way the Doctor comments on the architect throughout.
There you go. Job done, paid in full. Clever old architect.
Very clever.
Still hate him.
Me too.
It's an interesting commentary on the character journey for this new Doctor, that perhaps he doesn't like what he's becoming since his regeneration. It's a pity that so much of the rest of this character arc is so weak, but these bits do work. Some of the other character setups work as well, although notice how I said setup, not anything more than that. Mr. Cyborg Man, and though I'm not looking up his actual name, does have an interesting setup in that he had to erase the memories of everyone he cared about to protect them when he was being interrogated in prison. The short scene establishing this would be rather effective if not for 2 reasons. Firstly, that Clara, surprise surprise, acts like a dick. Mr. Cyborg Man explains that, as I said, he had to delete those memories while being interrogated, and she replies,
You deleted your friends?
My friends, anyone who ever helped me, my family.
Your family?
Of course my family.
How could you do that?
Well, I think he just explained it, Miss Know-It-All, to protect them while he was in prison. Please try and listen to things that are explained to you 15 seconds before. To be fair to the scene, it then leads into a pretty good line.
Well, I don't know. Suppose I must have loved them.
But then this leads to problem number 2, that it's not remotely explored beyond this conversation, but we'll get to that. I do actually wish, before I start the rant section of this video, to briefly discuss the Doctor's Series 8 arc. The full discussion of this is something for another time, but basically the reason it doesn't work for me is that it feels inconsistent and lightweight. We're told he is now this dark, pragmatic Doctor, willing to make any sacrifice in order to, well, essentially, in order to win. The morality of the previous New Who Doctors is turned on its head. This is a Doctor who will sacrifice for the greater good. Now, as an idea, I like this fine, but the issue with it was how shockingly inconsistent it was, which came down to a few reasons. Firstly, it was too frequently undermined by Moffat's issues with tone in this terrible comedy, Quelle Surprise. Secondly, the way it was presented was just completely different from episode to episode. There are some episodes where he seemed astonishingly indifferent to people's lives, to the point where he seemed less darkly pragmatic and more just like a flaming arsehole. It also just meant he frequently came across like a judgmental, hypocritical prick, and most importantly, someone who just did not have the charm and likability of a Doctor should have. Now, I'm not blaming Capaldi for this. He always put in his best work, made him seem better than the words on the page, and he had his moments when he was written more to the strengths of this arc, like in Mummy and on the Orient Express, where his antagonism is reined in, and it's clear his pragmatism is that, not indifference. But nevertheless, it did sometimes feel that way. Thirdly, it felt directionless. Sure, he's now this dark pragmatist, but to what end? What's the result and consequences of this? What's the purpose from a story point of view? It felt like it had no real point to it, and it contributed to how weak the overall storytelling of Series 8 is to me. The relevance of Time Heist is that it's a sign of how the arc played out. There are signs of what worked about it, as I said, but equally signs of why it ultimately failed to work all that effectively. For every good moment like the ones I mentioned, there's one that either doesn't work in establishing it or just undermines it entirely. For instance, when Odo, again, I'm not looking up her actual name and she's a shapeshifter, so I'm naming her after Odo from Deep Space Nine, gets, we think, vaporized but not really, the idea of the Doctor forcing this as cold necessity just doesn't work, mostly because the scene is written so passively. The Doctor isn't making a sacrifice to save the rest of them, Odo realises it's her only way out from a fate worse than death, and the Doctor just sort of doesn't object. I'd buy it if it was meant to be more than about her than him, but given it plays into the good man motif, I doubt that. Which, by the way, is ridiculous. Odo asked the Doctor to kill the Architect, which the Doctor can't promise, which is an interesting bit. But then it's undermined by her calling him a good man, which... What, because he won't kill someone just because you asked him to? Oh, I'm overwhelmed by his kindness and generosity and not murdering someone just because you said please. And her statement is simply not backed up by events. The character stuff has been so thin, she's basing this off one conversation, it seems like. She hasn't been able to get a proper read of the Doctor's character so far to make this call. She hasn't been able to make a judgment about whether his new way of looking at things make him seem a good man or not because of this. She's saying it because the script says so. In terms of the second point, it does undermine itself all the time, and much of this comes from the Moffat approach to these scripts, I'm afraid. A ruthless pragmatist that will always do the right thing nevertheless doesn't really come across when the character is saying lines like "shut-it up, up, up." You torpedoed your last Doctor's character journey by making him perform wacky comedy in lieu of the actual arc, and here he seems determined to make the same mistake. Another moment is when Mr. Cyborg Man and Odo reveal themselves as having survived. Now, there are a lot of problems with this scene I'll get to later, but this could have been genius. The Doctor, at seeing them, is momentarily overcome by relief that they're alive, but quickly steels himself. There'll be time to celebrate later or something like that, but the brief moment where he shows that would have made it obvious to both the characters and the audience how he really felt. Indeed, part of why this arc works in Mummy and the Orient Express, not this directly obviously, but the idea that despite the exterior it is genuine concern that is motivating this. Instead here, he acts sort of confused and bewildered the entire time, which is not what you want from someone undergoing this character work. That tiny change would have massively improved this for me. As for the supporting characters, it is mostly disappointment. Potentially fascinating ideas are set up but go absolutely nowhere. Mr. Cyborg Man, as I said, has a great backstory. He had to erase his memories of everyone he cared about to protect them. Imagine the potential there, the bitter regret that punctuates every thought he has, the longing for a way, any way to turn back time and preventing it having happened, and indeed, in the end, his reward of having those memories restored, and what that means to him. And I won't take, well, there wasn't time for this, as an answer. There's a lot you could cut down in this episode to make room, and it would only require a few more minutes, but instead we get one conversation between him and Clara that sets this up, and it goes nowhere. He sacrifices himself to save Clara because apparently they have some deep connection after sharing one 30-second conversation about 10 minutes before, and his speech there is just so generic it could have been said by anyone if you changed a few details. Oh, and it turns out he's still alive, of course, but then he and Odo, and frankly Clara for all that matter, although I'm complaining a lot about the last one, have absolutely fuck all to do for the last 10-15 minutes of the episode, so nothing is explored about what such a backstory means and how it would affect him. It happened, he explains it, and he's a bit moody as a result, and then, he gets them back at the end. Of course, having the long-lost memories of everyone he ever cared about getting restored gets so much as a, that's neat, thanks. There's even less of it for Odo, whose shape-shifting abilities work by touching someone, which means she can't ever touch anyone. What this would mean for her is talked about as an even shorter conversation with the Doctor, and boils down to, it's a bit shit. Then she dies, and it turns out she didn't die, and it's practically ornamental for the rest of the episode. There's one nice bit at the end of her, she's able to hug the Doctor as thanks, something she wouldn't be able to do before, obviously. But that would have been far more powerful if there had been development for this rather than just, it happened and that's that. In typical New Who fashion, it's a shockingly wasted potential. Then of course there's the main villain for the piece. Security Chief Delphox, played by Keeley Hawes, who's thoroughly wasted in this role. Delphox stands around, looks a bit villainous and barks some orders, but that's about it. She also acts like a stereotypically idiotic villain, as when the Doctor and Clara get captured by the Teller, instead of just immediately having their heads flattened and calling it that, she drags them up to her office to gloat and exposit at them, then leaves before they're actually killed. Only for the security guys there to be Mr. Cyborg Man and Odo, which kind of scuppered that. Which, by the way, how the hell did they manage to infiltrate the bank security team and get so high up the pyramid there personally with the security chief in the, let's be extremely generous and say about half an hour or so since they got teleported? Anyway, she's given nothing interesting to do apart from being a bad Bond villain. Of course, it leads into the twist that she is in fact a clone of Madame Carabraxos, the person in charge of the bank. I remember when I watched this originally that it was a staggeringly obvious twist, and it's not an interesting one to make up for it. All it leads to are some really awful jokes about being fired, meaning being set on fire, which is eye-rolling the first time and just exasperating the 7th or 8th. It never gets close to being funny. And some stuff with the ending which we'll get to later. but Carabox's is just as lame as the villain. Hawes does try, but the script is just giving her nothing to work with. As for the plot itself, it's weak and full of holes. Now, there are a lot of minor bits which are a problem, but are kind of the thing I'd be happier to dismiss if the overall episode was stronger. For instance, if Mr. Cyborg Man is wiping his own memory using his systems, why does he even have a memory worm to begin with? That he's using his own systems to do it is hardly compromising information they need to hide from the teller, so is the Doctor just making it harder for himself? Now again, that's the kind of minor thing I'd be happy to dismiss if the overall episode was stronger, because all fiction, even the very best examples, can have some small logic hiccups like that, and it's fine. The issue is when there's not really that much that's good to distract from it, so it becomes more glaring. And there are far bigger issues than that. Odo has to disguise as a customer they had the DNA for to get into the bank in the first place. First off, you can't touch DNA, even with my embarrassingly poor knowledge of science I know that, and her powers are based off touching, so that makes no sense. But the bigger question is, why is this even necessary? Particularly as the other three are not disguised, and Cyborg Man in particular looks extremely conspicuous, so it's not as if you're not going to be drawing attention if that's the concern. I mean, yeah, the guy's breath unlocks it for them, which is another question entirely as to how she's shapeshifted enough to replicate breath, but it feels like that's a more minor thing to overcome that doesn't really need a shapeshifter. It feels like it's there just to justify Odo's inclusion and to be a quick and cheap way to get them in, and I think a more intelligent way of doing it should have been attempted. Another issue I have is that it's made clear in the teller's first scene where he flattens the head of the bloke who looks like he should be a candidate on The Apprentice that it's extremely difficult to try and not think about something for the obvious reason that if you're thinking about not thinking about it, you're thinking about it. Which I actually did like as a small bit, showing the danger of the teller to our heroes and that trying to block its powers is futile. Which makes it all the more ridiculous that later on the Doctor tells Clara to clear her mind. You've already established in this episode, and indeed in common sense, that's extremely difficult. Why are we expecting characters to do things we've already established isn't possible? Is the Doctor just trying to get rid of Clara? And hey, desperate times, desperate measures and all that. But did the writers just have amnesia about what they'd written earlier? Oh, and briefly speaking of the teller's first scene, what legal authority does this bank operate under? I'd be really interested to know who's authorising them to basically summarily execute anyone who's planning to pull off a bit of fraud. Yes, modern high-security banks have armed security, but they tend to reserve the shooting for when the bank robber comes in with weapons themselves, rather than he intends to fiddle with some finances. Oh, and also this.
Explains why we're not here in the TARDIS.
Sorry, what?
The solar disruption would have made navigation impossible. The one time the bank is vulnerable is the one time we can't just land.
What? You realise you could have just landed the TARDIS before the storm, waited for a bit, then come out to get what you needed? Yes, I know that's not what they're actually here for, but I only know that because I finished the episode. The Doctor doesn't at this point, so it's still an incredibly stupid statement. It takes a noble writer to draw attention to his idiot logic holes. As a final example, we get this.
In the last few days, there's been a block.
Okay, I'm calling bullshit on this, and further demonstrates this was a script not thought out. This entire episode takes place over, at most, about half a day or so, and that is frankly being extremely generous. What exactly took you a few days? Because it's absolutely impossible you've been in the bank longer than a few hours. What, did it take you a few days to walk from your hideout to the bank? Now, you might be saying, well, he means all the organising and stuff, being the architects and all that, to which I say, no he doesn't, because he doesn't remember any of that yet. So you might also be saying that's a minor thing, but keeping up the believability of the story you're telling is important for maintaining suspension of disbelief, especially when the other elements aren't good enough to overcome it. And they ain't. The biggest problem with this episode for me is that despite all the potential and all the interesting setups, the plot is just lightweight and thin. It feels like it's a journey from one event to the next, and that's it. This happens, and something else happens, and they move on to something else, etc. Without any greater insight into character, or exploration of theme, or anything like that. Now, focusing on your plot is fine, but this is basically just trading off one idea. Doctor Who does a bank heist, and there are enough holes in the rest of the plot to make this episode legally a Swiss cheese. It feels like the episode progresses without anything actually achieving anything or going anywhere. It wasn't until we got to Clara and Mr. Cyborg's man brief conversation, which comes a good 15 to 20 minutes into the episode, that it fully struck me. This was frankly the first point at which we were actually getting anything at all, and even then it was barely anything and it went nowhere. This episode feels like it's here just to play out the events and not do anything else. This is demonstrating best at the ending, where they enter Madame Carabox's high security vault by just entering through the ventilation shaft. For a top security bank where people with the wrong breath are incinerated and thinking of minor fraud gets your head flattened by a telepathic rhino, that seems like a bit of an oversight, don't you think? Anyway, they enter in and this is where it all comes to a head. Long story short, it's revealed that the Doctor is the architect and he came here to rescue the teller. This is good, As I said earlier, it's a good twist for the Doctor being behind it all, especially when compared to some earlier remarks of his, and the idea of this monster who'd been running from more story actually being the victim is a neat reversal of expectations, and a perfectly understandable motive for the Doctor, especially this one given what they were trying to do with him. What doesn't work is how haphazardly it's all thrown together. The Doctor finds out by letting the teller do its thing to him, which seems idiotically suicidal, I think is the word I'm looking for. The idea of Carabraxos being a clone is, I think, justified in the idea of the parallel between two people being played by other versions of themselves, as the architect being the Doctor and Carabraxos having her clones, but all that's done with this potentially interesting idea is that it's there. Nothing can be inferred about the characters or how it relates to the plot, just they both have other versions of themselves doing stuff to them. Oh, and this whole thing was set up by an elderly Carabraxos herself. Wow, a regretful old woman trying to undo her biggest mistake, and is willing to go to such lengths to redeem herself in her own eyes before she dies. A powerful message, and one that ties into the ideas of some of these characters, that of Mr. Cyborg Man, and indeed the Teller, of how protecting or saving what one truly cares about can lead to extraordinary ends, and regrets. In this case, for Madam K, it's her own conscience on her deathbed. The big problem with that is I had to make up almost all of it, because in the actual episode itself, it's one sentence from which we can infer she's a bit sorry about it once it's sorted out. Less time is dedicated to the whole reason of the episode is happening, with the jokes about setting workers she's getting rid of on fire. Honestly, can you think of anything more New Who? It's a disappointment going through this episode and seeing the ideas that are squandered. The finale is a perfect example. So much could be done, but it's just breezed through, and we focus more on shitty dialogue that's intended to convey wackiness than anything important. Like, finding out this is because of Madam K herself this is happening, it's just an event. It's not a character moment, it's not an exploration of a theme, it's just a thing that happens to wrap up the plot. It's emblematic of the biggest problem with New Who for me. It frequently feels like it should be so much more as it is. The ingredients are almost always there, but they're never used. I don't think this episode is awful or anything, not close. There's some good stuff to it, and it's not exactly an unpleasant watch or anything. But all it is a collection of things that haven't put together, a few minor bits notwithstanding. This should have been more, it's not. The final score for Time Heist is 5 out of 10. It is typical of the quality you'd expect from New Who. It does move fairly well, it has a few interesting ideas, Peter Capaldi gives a fine performance as always, and it's not particularly terrible or anything like that, given what the next two episodes would be, sometimes count your blessings. But it fails to reach any of its potential with a thin plot and weak characters. It feels like a journey without much of a purpose, there to fill 45 minutes of television and actually say or do anything of interest. So yeah, average New Who to me, I'm afraid. Next time, we continue our look at the Daleks with The Chase, and after that, we return to Series 8 again. For something that only those with strong hearts should brave. Stay tuned.